The wind stirred faintly through the velvet drapes of the Belle Fontaine Club's upper lounge, where the guests of the annual Calvé Foundation Gala stood arrayed like chess pieces, polished, posed, and full of secrets. Waiters in white gloves floated between them with silver trays of champagne, but even their movements seemed calculated, rehearsed to match the evening's curated elegance. Among the guests were titled aristocrats, investors, retired diplomats, and society's lesser-known benefactors who preferred influence to attention. But of all the figures present that evening, only one man held the room in an invisible grip, though he spoke to no one, raised no glass, and offered not even a name. He was simply there, a tall, clean-shaven man in an ivory dinner jacket, too new to be comfortable, too calm to be new. No one knew who had invited him. The maître d'hôtel could not account for him on the guest list, and yet no one dared ask him to leave. Perhaps it was the sharpness of his gaze or the stillness with which he stood near the grand piano, observing everything. And yet none of this would have raised more than gossip had it not been for what happened 37 minutes into the gala. Lady Agatha Desmarais, the 73-year-old widow of the shipping magnate Lionel Desmarais, had just finished her second sherry when she collapsed in her chair, her mouth slack and her eyes wide with a fixed, unnatural calm. A hush spread like spilled ink. Someone whispered that it was a stroke. Others suggested heart failure. It was the stranger who stepped forward, not to assist, but to mutter one sentence to the nearest waiter. "Check the glass." It wasn't hers. A wave of confusion followed. A doctor was summoned, but Lady Agatha was pronounced dead before the hour ended. The police arrived late, eager to minimize fuss. They attributed the event to natural causes, pending review. But as guests were being politely ushered toward their coats and umbrellas, a woman, sharp-boned, severe, and draped in patent red silk, caught the officer's sleeve and whispered something in his ear. Her name was Madame Alizée Bertrand, and she had called someone far more precise than the law. It was 2 hours later when Hercule Poirot arrived at the Belle Fontaine, immaculate in a grey morning suit, despite the lateness of the hour. He removed his gloves with care, stepped over the red velvet rope blocking the upper lounge, and surveyed the room not as a detective looking for answers, but as a perfectionist surveying a disarranged bouquet. "An old woman dies at a gala," murmured Inspector Wren, a skeptical, broad-nosed man in uniform, and a stranger makes a cryptic comment. "That is hardly a crime," Poirot smiled without warmth. "And yet, mon ami, in life, the subtle gesture is often the most violent." He turned his attention to the piano, still gleaming in the corner. "Tell me, has the gentleman who made the remark been identified?" Wren shook his head. "Disappeared before we took statements. No one knows who he was. No fingerprints. No name on the guest list. We thought he might have been part of the musical ensemble, but the pianist says no. He was simply there." "Exactement. That is why I am here." Poirot's fingers tapped lightly along the top of a silver tray, left abandoned. "Madame Bertrand called me. She says the stranger knew things he should not have known. I would like to know how Poirot insisted on inspecting the lounge before the body was removed." He approached Lady Agatha's table and examined the crystal glasses, the remnants of a meal half-eaten, and a small sachet of lavender tucked into her handbag. "She was not afraid of dying," he said suddenly. "She carried lavender. People who fear death tend to carry medicine, not perfume." He bent lower and examined a discarded napkin. Then his hand froze above a teaspoon, which bore a faint lip print. Not Lady Agatha's, he observed, but from someone wearing a different shade of lipstick. Poirot signaled Wren. "There were 3 people seated here at the time of her death," Poirot noted. "Lady Agatha, Lord Calvé, and his niece, Miss Estelle. But only 2 wine glasses. And this spoon, it was used by someone not presently accounted for." Wren scoffed. That's hardly unusual at an event like this. Non, mon ami, it is precisely unusual, especially when the deceased was known for being particular. Lady Agatha never shared her utensils. Her late husband was obsessive about hygiene. She retained the habit. That she allowed another to use her spoon suggests either coercion or deceit. Poirot turned, his brow furrowed in that theatrical but unnervingly accurate fashion of his. This was not a natural death. Nor was it clumsy. It was staged, just enough to pass as plausible, unless one knew exactly what to look for. The inspector sighed. You still have no proof. Ah, Poirot said softly, but the stranger did. And with that, the game had begun. By sunrise, Poirot had secured the guest list and ordered copies of every photograph taken that night. The Belle Fontaine was notorious for discreet photography, pictures taken not for tabloids but for wealthy egos. It was in these photographs that Poirot hoped to find his first thread. He also requested a complete service staff record and ordered every glass and plate from the deceased's table to be preserved. He wanted the water bottles, the linen, even the chair cushions. Nothing, he warned, is too unimportant when a person is murdered in plain sight. He paused at the piano last, where the stranger had stood, and gently pressed a single key. A low note rang out, followed by silence. Poirot glanced at the floor and smiled faintly. He did not stand here by accident, he whispered. He chose this spot for a reason. When Hastings later asked Poirot what struck him most about the evening, the detective answered without hesitation that someone dared to play God, and someone else already knew. The case of the stranger who knew everything had begun. The morning after Lady Agatha's death, the Belle Fontaine's entrance remained locked to the public with a discreet sign announcing private maintenance. But behind those locked doors, Hercule Poirot paced the length of the empty lounge, his hands tucked neatly behind his back, his gaze fixed on every detail as if the furniture might whisper confessions. He had returned at dawn to begin what he called the ritual of reconstruction, a meticulous revisiting of every moment from the gala, based on layout, position, timing, and instinct. Poirot summoned the maître d'hôtel, a wiry man named Lucien with nervous hands and eyes that darted like minnows. Monsieur, Poirot began, you were present last night from start to finish, oui? Lucien nodded, twisting his towel with the despair of someone dragged into a scandal far above his station. Yes, Monsieur Poirot. I watched over the guest flow, ensured the waiters rotated evenly, oversaw the kitchen. Everything was routine. Poirot gestured for him to walk through the steps. You must now be my memory. At what precise time did Lady Agatha arrive? Shortly after 8. She was among the earliest, and who was already present? Lucien hesitated, then rattled off names from the guest list. Lord Calvet, his niece Estelle, the German industrialist Herr Grubner, the pianist Monsieur Valéry, and the striking Madame Alizée Bertrand. A few others had arrived soon after, socialites, patrons, old money, and old habits. Poirot's mustache twitched. And this man, Poirot said gently. The one no one recalls inviting. When did he arrive? Lucien looked puzzled. That is just it, monsieur. I never saw him enter. I noticed him only once the music began. He stood by the piano as if waiting for a cue. Poirot's eyes lit up. A man who arrives without arrival. That is not a guest. That is a signal. Did anyone speak with him? Not to my knowledge. He was watching. Poirot asked to see the seating chart again, then motioned to the chairs that had been moved after the incident. He insisted everything be returned to its original position and requested Lucien retrieve the specific bottle of sherry that had been poured for Lady Agatha. When the maitre d' hesitated, Poirot raised a brow. You kept the bottles separate by label, yes? Lucien nodded. Yes, we used the Calvet Reserve, only 6 bottles. And only Lady Agatha drank from the third, n'est-ce pas? Yes, I poured it myself. Poirot took note. Then bring it to me, unopened if you have another. If not, the remainder of her bottle, Lucien hurried off, while Poirot moved to the mirrored column between the piano and the balcony doors. It gave an uninterrupted view of the entire lounge. Every guest, every exit, every toast and nod. The stranger had stood there deliberately, not to hide, but to see. Rennes arrived shortly after, visibly annoyed by the early hour and Poirot's persistence. You're turning a suspicious death into a full-blown murder case based on a comment from a man who may have been mad. Poirot responded without turning. No madman stands still in a room full of powerful people unless he knows something, and Lady Agatha did not die because of fate. She died because someone assumed no one would ask the correct question, and what question is that? Poirot turned now, his gaze sharp. Who benefits? And not merely in money, mon ami. Prestige, silence, leverage, revenge. They are currencies far more deadly. He requested Rennes accompany him for a second round of statements, beginning with Madame Alice Bertrand. They found her seated in the hotel's drawing room, arms folded, red dress replaced with a severe black coat. She greeted Poirot with a tone that barely masked disdain. I called you because no one else had the nerve to consider what really happened, she said coolly. Agatha Desmarais was detested by many, but feared by more. She had information, things whispered to her over the years. She collected secrets like stamps. Poirot nodded. And was she threatening to reveal any? Alice tapped a gloved finger against her lips. Nothing specific. But she'd begun writing letters again. Old-fashioned, handwritten, sealed with her family crest. I know at least 2 were received this month, one by Estelle Calvet, the other by a retired MP who immediately booked a passage to Florence. Poirot leaned forward. Did you see the contents of these letters? No, she said, but I know fear when I see it. And that girl, Estelle, was trembling last week. Poirot asked about the stranger. Alice's tone shifted slightly. Yes, I saw him. I remember him watching Lady Agatha like a hawk. He didn't flinch when she died. That's not shock, that's certainty. With this, Poirot returned to the now sealed lounge. Lucien had left the requested bottle on a silver tray, its seal unbroken. Poirot sniffed it, then uncorked it, and poured a measure into a clean glass. He did not drink. Instead, he dipped a folded strip of blotting paper into the liquid, inspecting it under the chandelier light. He noted the faintest shimmer, not cloudy, but off. Something had been added, something meant to vanish into alcohol's texture. Poirot pocketed the paper and turned to Rennes. We must request a talk screen, discreetly. If I am wrong, it is mere waste. But if I am right, you think she was poisoned at the table? No, that would be brutish. I believe she was primed, slowly, carefully, something that would interact with alcohol, and I believe the stranger knew because he watched the moment the interaction occurred. As if on cue, a porter entered with a thick envelope. Monsieur Poirot, he said, this arrived for you just now. No return address. Left at the desk, Poirot opened it. Inside was a single photograph from the gala, black and white, slightly blurred. But the subject was unmistakable. The stranger, head turned, eyes focused on something or someone off frame. Scrawled in ink at the bottom, he sees what others refuse to admit. Poirot stood silent for a long moment, then whispered, Mon Dieu. He is not the killer. He is the witness the killer did not expect. And somewhere in the room, the game changed. The envelope containing the mysterious photograph lay on the polished table like a gauntlet tossed at Poirot's feet. Hastings, who had arrived half an hour ago, summoned by Poirot's brief telegram, stood over it, trying to make sense of the stranger's expression in the grainy print. He looks too calm, Hastings murmured, as if he knew she was going to die. Poirot nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving the photograph. Just so, mon ami. He's either complicit or a man who has seen the pieces long before they were shuffled into play. Poirot's tone was not concerned, but rather intrigued, even reverent, as if acknowledging the presence of an adversary whose mind was structured not unlike his own. "Where was this photo taken exactly?" Hastings asked, still studying the image. Poirot answered without pause. "It was taken from the western mezzanine balcony of the lounge." The angle suggests that whoever took it was not simply photographing the event, but watching him. The presence of this photograph in my hands suggests that someone in that room knew I would come, knew I would take the case. That, mon ami, is not coincidence. Poirot turned to Inspector Wren, who had returned with a typed preliminary toxicology report. Early indicators show traces of aconitine, extremely rare and fatal in small doses, especially when mixed with alcohol. No smell, almost no taste. "Derived from monkshood," Poirot said softly. "Used historically to dispatch rivals discreetly." The symptoms align with Lady Agatha's demise. Sudden collapse, slowed heart, and paralysis masked as fatigue. Wren frowned. So someone poisoned her hours in advance. "Not necessarily hours," Poirot said. "The effect depends on dosage and timing, but it would have required premeditation and, more importantly, proximity." Hastings looked up. "You mean the killer had to be close enough to place the poison, maybe in her drink?" Poirot shook his head. "No, that is the work of amateurs. The poison was likely administered earlier, in a form absorbed slowly, perhaps in her cosmetics or her food. The sherry only activated what had already been placed. The glass was the final act in a sequence." Wren scoffed. "So we're back to motive. Who had reason to want her dead?" "Nearly everyone," Poirot said, almost cheerfully. "Lady Agatha knew too much. Secrets are currency, and she was the central bank." He motioned to Hastings. "Come, we must speak to Miss Estelle Calvet." She received one of Lady Agatha's handwritten letters. "I suspect its contents are at the heart of all this." They found Estelle in the garden lounge of the adjacent Bellefontaine Annex, seated alone with a cigarette she hadn't lit. She looked pale, but not grieving, more like someone caught between exhaustion and anticipation. Poirot introduced himself, and Estelle nodded in recognition. "I suppose you're here about Aunt Agatha," she said quietly. "She was difficult, but not deserving of this." Poirot leaned forward. "Miss Calvet, you received a letter from her last week, did you not?" Estelle hesitated. "Yes, I burned it. May I ask why?" "It frightened me," she said, her voice cracking. "She wrote that she was compiling a record of misdeeds, that she intended to leave behind a legacy of truth. She claimed people like my uncle and myself had benefited from things we never earned. She was unkind, but not wrong." "What exactly had you benefited from, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently. Estelle looked away. "My inheritance was supposed to come from my father. He left it in the trust of Uncle Calvet. But Aunt Agatha suspected he had rerouted parts of it to cover some debts and misjudged ventures. She said she had proof." Poirot folded his hands. "And did she intend to reveal this at the gala?" "I don't know. But she was smiling all evening, like she was planning something." "Did you speak to the man near the piano?" Poirot asked suddenly. Estelle blinked. "Only once. I bumped into him while looking for the ladies' powder room. He was odd. Polite, but too aware. He told me to breathe deeply and said, 'The air will change soon.'" Poirot nodded slowly. "Merci, mademoiselle. That will be all. For now." As they left, Hastings whispered, "She's terrified." And hiding something, Poirot gave a slight smile. "Ah, but of course, everyone is hiding something. The question is, who is hiding murder?" They returned to Poirot's temporary suite at the Belle Fontaine, where he had requested a complete archive of guest photos and event schedules. The photographs taken during the gala were spread across a long table. Poirot began sorting them chronologically. "There," he said, pointing to one. "See that?" The stranger is not just watching the crowd. He's facing only 3 individuals during the entire sequence of photos: Lady Agatha, Miss Estelle, and a man standing behind a curtain near the servants' entrance. Zoom in, Hastings squinted. "Is that Lord Calvé? Oui, the benefactor of the gala, and the man who stood to lose most if Lady Agatha made her letters public." Poirot called for Lord Calvé immediately. The man arrived stiffly, his expression unreadable. He was in his late 60s with a reputation for charity and a long shadow of financial speculation behind his public image. "Do you mind, Lord Calvé," Poirot began, "if we ask where you were standing at the moment of Lady Agatha's collapse?" Calvé blinked. "I was returning from the powder room." "Strange," Poirot murmured, "since we have a photograph of you by the curtain at that exact time." Calvé stiffened. "I must have paused." "I don't recall." "You also received a letter," Poirot said. "Was its content as flattering as Miss Estelle's?" There was a pause. Then Calvé said coldly, "She accused me of redirecting my late brother's estate." It was baseless. She was always meddlesome. "Perhaps," Poirot said softly, "but now she is dead, and someone in this room knows why Calvé rose. I've answered your questions." As he left, Poirot's eyes narrowed. He is on edge, but not guilty in the way one expects. He fears exposure, yes. But I sense he did not act alone. He does not have the finesse. Hastings raised an eyebrow. "Then who?" Poirot didn't answer. He walked to the side table, retrieved the photograph again, and looked once more at the stranger's calm expression. The man who knew everything watched a murder unfold and said only one thing: "Check the glass." He wasn't warning. He was testing. Testing what? Poirot looked up, eyes sharp. Whether I would understand. Rain pattered against the Belle Fontaine's tall, arched windows as Poirot sat motionless at the small mahogany writing desk in his suite. The morning's events had left behind a curious residue, not one of fear, but of challenge. Poirot was not merely investigating a crime. He was participating in a battle of observation, orchestrated by someone who had chosen not to act, but to witness, and in doing so had forced Poirot into a precise and psychological duel. The stranger hadn't revealed a name, hadn't made a scene, hadn't offered aid. He had simply spoken the one sentence that began the unraveling: "Check the glass." It wasn't hers. Hastings entered the room with a folder containing the staff background reports Poirot had requested. "You were right," he said. "Every server at the gala was accounted for, except one." Poirot looked up. "Except?" "One man signed in at 5:42 p.m. under the name Jules Lemoine. But no one remembers seeing him actually serve. His ID was scanned, uniform collected. After that, nothing. He didn't punch out, and the name doesn't match any records from the hotel's staffing agency." Poirot's brow furrowed. So the stranger did not come as a guest. He came as staff. He placed himself inside the system, only to vanish without a trace. "And get this," Hastings added. "One of the cameras at the rear service corridor shows someone changing jackets, white uniform into black overcoat." Face obscured, Poirot folded his hands. "And he left the building unseen. C'est magnifique." Not only did he observe a murder, he anticipated how it would be misunderstood and arranged his own disappearance as part of the performance. "But why?" Hastings asked. "Why go through all that trouble just to point at a glass?" Poirot stood and moved to the window. "Because he wants something uncovered, but not by him. He has the knowledge, perhaps even the motive, but he leaves the burden of proof to me." "Why?" Either he cannot reveal himself, or he chooses not to. A knock came at the door. It was Lucien, the maître d'hôtel, holding a small parcel wrapped in thick brown paper. Monsieur Poirot, this arrived downstairs. Left by courier. No return address again. Poirot took it carefully and unwrapped it. Inside was a second photograph. Another shot of the gala. This time, Lady Agatha is mid-sentence, mouth slightly open, finger pointing at someone. Behind her, slightly blurred, is a man lifting a glass to his lips. Scrawled underneath in the same sharp handwriting as before. Every movement has its moment. This was hers. Poirot studied the angle. The moment was exact. Too exact to have been a random photo. This person, he said quietly, has orchestrated more than mere observation. He's building a sequence. He is reconstructing the crime through images, as I reconstruct it through psychology. He turned the photograph over. There was something faint, embossed into the paper's fibers. Poirot held it under the desk lamp. An address, barely legible, 17 Rue Montcart, 5th arrondissement, Paris. He smiled. At last, our phantom gives us a trail. Hastings straightened. Are we going to Paris? Poirot shook his head. Not yet. We must first complete our picture here. Rue Montcart may hold the ghost, but the crime was committed here in this palace of mirrors, and I begin to suspect that Lady Agatha's killer hoped I would look only at her enemies. But perhaps the motive was not hatred, but silence. Poirot turned back to the guest records, now marked with red pencil. There is one guest who has not been forthcoming. Herr Grubner. He spoke little during the gala, left quietly, and has not returned our request for an interview. Hastings frowned. The industrialist? Yes, Poirot said, and an old acquaintance of Lady Agatha's. They once sat on the same diplomatic committee overseeing shipping trade disputes. A quiet war occurred between them. Agatha accused him of laundering bribes through a foreign charity. The matter vanished. No trial, no article. But the damage lingered. You think he had her killed to prevent her from reopening the case? I think, Poirot said, that she may have confronted him that night. And he panicked. They arranged for Grubner to be brought in under pretense of a final witness statement. He arrived at Poirot's suite in a thick brown overcoat, his demeanor unreadable, his English clipped and mechanical. I do not understand the fuss, Grubner said. She was old. She drank. It was unfortunate, yes, but we should not invent scandal for convenience. Poirot smiled. No. I agree entirely. But I have one question, Herr Grubner. During the gala, where were you seated during Lady Agatha's toast? Grubner blinked. Near the west wall. I was speaking with the pianist. Interesting, Poirot said. Because in this photograph, you are clearly seen facing her, drink in hand, with no one else near you. Grubner stared at the image, then shrugged. The moment must have been brief. Poirot tapped the photograph. Did Lady Agatha speak to you that evening? Grubner's jaw tightened. She made veiled comments. Accused me, again, of matters long dead. I ignored her. Did she mention the name Lemoine to you? There was a flicker, quick but visible. No. Should she have? Poirot tilted his head. Curious. Because a man using that name inserted himself into the event, disguised, watching. He knew what would happen, and if he was sent by Lady Agatha, or sent to watch her, he may have had a reason to fear you. Grubner stood abruptly. This is nonsense. I do not tolerate insult. Poirot let him go. When the door shut, Hastings turned to him. He's hiding something. Oui, Poirot said, but he did not kill her. His fear is real, but reactionary. He's afraid of being named, but not of guilt. The true killer is someone who thought Agatha's death would prevent exposure. But instead, the death created ripples. He returned to the photographs. Let us list the facts, mon ami. 1. Lady Agatha dies in public, but her symptoms match a rare, subtle poison. 2. A man disguised as staff vanishes after delivering a cryptic warning. 3. 2 anonymous photographs are sent to me, revealing moments no one else would focus on. 4. Lady Agatha sent letters, accusations, days before the gala. And 5. There is now an address in Paris Poirot turned to Hastings, eyes sharp. Before we leave for Rue Montcart, I must do one more thing. I must visit the home of Lady Agatha des Marais. What for? Poirot smiled. To examine what she didn't bring to the gala. Because if someone killed her to suppress a secret, they may have failed. The true danger may yet remain, quiet, folded in a drawer, or locked in a box. And with that, Poirot reached for his gloves, his hat, and his little grey cells. The des Marais estate stood at the edge of Hampstead like a relic from another century, its gates rusted with disuse and its gardens long overtaken by ivy and wild fennel. Yet inside, the house preserved the sort of quiet dignity only the very rich or the very meticulous could maintain. Poirot stood at the threshold with Hastings as the caretaker, a thin man named Fitch, nervously unlocked the door. Lady Agatha hadn't taken guests here in years, Fitch explained. She came for quiet. Wrote her letters in the library most afternoons. Poirot offered a cordial nod. And since her passing, you have not entered the study? No, sir. Locked it myself after the police sealed the house. Très bien. Inside, the air was heavy with old leather and dust, but the layout was precise. Nothing suggested disorder or haste. Lady Agatha had lived deliberately. Poirot moved through the main hall slowly, stopping at the grand staircase. He noticed a chipped tile at its base. He crouched to inspect it. Recently broken, he murmured. Not by age. Fitch looked uncomfortable. That must have been me. Dropped a box the day she died. Poirot rose. And what was in this box? Old photographs. She'd asked me to bring them down from the attic. Did she say why? She wanted to compare faces. Something about recognition. But then she cancelled tea and stayed in her study the rest of the day. Poirot turned to Hastings. You see, my friend? Even before the gala, she was searching. Not broadcasting, but narrowing in on something. They reached the study. Fitch handed Poirot a brass key. Poirot turned it carefully and entered. The room was modest but immaculate. Shelves of diplomatic memoirs, classical histories, and French novels. A heavy desk stood near the window, facing a narrow garden path. On it, a letter opener, 2 inkwells, a blotting pad, and a single envelope marked, "To be posted, only in the event of my death." Poirot opened it gently. Inside was a 4-page handwritten letter addressed to a journalist named Cécile Durand of Le Matin de Paris. The contents were dense, but its thrust was clear. Lady Agatha was preparing to expose a long-standing web of financial blackmail, naming names that included Lord Calvert, Herr Grubner, and an unnamed observer, whose information was said to be so precise it bordered on unnatural. She believed someone had been feeding secrets to all parties, Poirot said aloud. An informant who knew enough to control multiple sides without loyalty to any. Hastings blinked. You think the stranger is this informant? I think the stranger is not new to this affair. He has likely been watching for years, moving between factions, selling truths for silence. He did not kill Lady Agatha, but he knew someone would try. That is why he was present. Poirot continued examining the room. In the drawer of the desk, beneath folded telegram slips, he found a journal with a blue ribbon bookmark. It was Agatha's private notes. She had listed names, dates, and symbols. A triangle was marked next to the entry from a week before her death. EC seen speaking to stranger again. Code word, Manticore. Manticore, Hastings said, puzzled. Poirot tapped his lip. Mythical beast, poison tail, a metaphor perhaps. But EC, Those are Estelle Calvé's initials. She was meeting the stranger. Poirot closed the journal. At the very least, she recognized him. He was not unknown to her. They left the study shortly afterward, Poirot ensuring the envelope and journal were preserved in his case. "Now we go to Paris," he declared, but not in search of the man himself. "We go to learn why he would hide behind a name, Jules Lemoine, and what binds him to a murder he did not commit." They arrived at 17 Rue Montcalm 2 days later. It was a nondescript building on a quiet residential street, 3 stories high, with a faded plaque that read Institut des Archives Diplomatiques, a former record-keeping branch, now converted into private rentals. A concierge met them at the entrance. "Monsieur Lemoine?" she asked, puzzled. "No tenant by that name." Poirot presented the photo. "Have you seen this man?" She squinted. "Oui. He lives on the 3rd floor. But he signs packages as Monsieur Alain Rousseau Poirot," exchanged a glance with Hastings. An alias for an alias. Precaution stacked upon caution, they climbed the staircase to the 3rd floor and knocked. No answer. Poirot tried again, then paused and turned the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the flat was small but meticulously ordered. Books filed by subject and date, drawers labeled in 3 languages, a kettle still warm on the stove. The man had left, but not long ago. Poirot scanned the wall above the writing desk. Pinned neatly were photographs, newspaper clippings of financial crimes, diplomatic scandals, even the gala invitation flyer. At the center, a photograph of Lady Agatha with a handwritten note beneath it. "She knew it all, but didn't know why I watched." Poirot examined the photos in silence, then opened the desk drawer. Inside were bundles of letters written in different handwriting, copies, not originals. Lady Agatha's distinctive cursive was among them. So were letters from others. Estelle, Calvé, even Grubner. This man had access to private correspondence from multiple parties. "He is not a blackmailer," Poirot said finally. "He is something rarer." A collector of leverage. Hastings nodded slowly. "But why send you the clues?" Poirot turned, "Because he does not wish to destroy. He wishes to reveal, but safely." He watched the world from the edge, until Lady Agatha threatened to burn it all down. So he chose the one person who could walk through the fire without being consumed. "You." "Oui, Hastings." Me Poirot opened the final drawer. Inside was a notebook marked Manticore. In it were coded references to transactions, meetings, even physical habits of every major suspect. But one entry stood out, underlined twice. Agatha kept the original records. If found, all leverage collapses. Estelle believes they are burned. She is wrong. Poirot closed the drawer. He knew she would die. He knew someone would kill to stop her, but he also knew she had prepared a failsafe. He turned to Hastings. "We must return to the Belle Fontaine. The true evidence is still somewhere in that lounge. Not a letter, not a confession, but a proof she hid in plain sight." Hastings blinked. "You're saying Lady Agatha brought it with her?" Poirot smiled. "No, I'm saying she showed it to the wrong person." They returned to the Belle Fontaine under the veil of a clouded evening, the sky stretched grey with low pressure and the promise of rain. Poirot moved quickly through the now emptied lounge, where fresh arrangements and scheduled luncheons had resumed as if no death had ever occurred within its walls. But Poirot knew better. Death left patterns, not stains, and it was in those patterns that he now sought the answer Agatha had carried with her. Not in a letter, nor a diary, but in a gesture, perhaps unnoticed even by herself. He called for the maître d'hôtel again. Lucien arrived moments later, now far less anxious, thinking perhaps that the worst had passed. Poirot greeted him politely and gestured to a nearby table in the far corner of the lounge. "This was Lady Agatha's table, oui?" "Yes, Monsieur Poirot." "And she arrived early, Chose that seat deliberately. She always took that corner, sir. Said she liked the view of the piano. Poirot's eyes narrowed. But during the toast, she moved. We have photographs. She stood and shifted one chair to her right. Why? Lucien frowned. I'm not sure I noticed. Precisely, Poirot said, and that is what matters. No one noticed. But she did. He walked over to the chair Lady Agatha had shifted to, positioned slightly askew from the center of the table. Poirot crouched and ran his hand along the underside of the seat. There, affixed with what felt like a thin strip of adhesive, was a small plastic envelope, expertly taped to the fabric lining. Poirot gently pulled it free and opened it. Inside were 3 folded sheets of paper, scanned copies of banking records tied to an offshore account in Belize, financial transactions marked under false charity names, and a typed confession, signed but unsigned, with a single letter. E. Mon Dieu, Hastings whispered, reading over his shoulder. This is it. This is what she was going to reveal. Poirot examined the final page. It was a typed transcript of a voice recording. The speaker was calm, meticulous, and damning. If she releases the documents, it's over. The donations were never filed. Calvet approved the route. I signed off on the wiring through the museum's fund. She believes it will restore her legacy, but she'll only be opening a tomb for all of us. No names were mentioned directly, but the implication was clear. Poirot folded the documents and sealed them in his case. Then he stood and addressed Hastings with rare solemnity. This was never about money. It was about control. Lady Agatha was the only one who knew the shape of the web, but the spider she feared most was the one who sat smiling across from her. You mean Estelle? Poirot nodded. Everything points to her, the cryptic journal entries, the known meetings with the stranger, and now this. He signs the confession, but that is too simple. It is too loud. They returned to their suite. Poirot placed the documents in his inner drawer, locked them, and then sat back in his chair, fingers pressed together beneath his chin. Let us revisit the timeline. Agatha arrives early. She brings with her these papers, already prepared. She attaches them beneath a chair, her second-choice seat. Why? Because she expects that someone might try to take the evidence from her purse or intercept it if she carries it openly. Hastings added, so she leaves it where no one would think to look. But she plans to retrieve it later? Or signal someone else to retrieve it, Poirot said. That someone being the stranger. You mean she trusted him? Poirot paused. Or she feared him less than she feared those around her. That is often enough. A knock interrupted them. Wren entered with a tight expression. You'll want to know. Grubner fled his hotel suite an hour ago. Staff say he was shouting on the phone before he left. Something about being followed. Poirot raised a brow. Where did he go? We're not sure. But we traced the number he was calling. It belongs to Lord Calvet's private residence. Ah, then the inner circle is beginning to fracture, Poirot said. Perfect. Wren frowned. What does that mean? It means, Poirot said, that when fear replaces strategy, mistakes follow. Poirot requested Estelle Calvet be brought to him at once. She arrived wearing a somber grey coat, her hair tied neatly, eyes wary. She took a seat, offered no greeting. I assume this is about my aunt again, she said. Yes, Poirot said, and also about Manticore. Her breath caught ever so slightly. I believe you've heard that word before, he continued, used in a conversation with a man who called himself Jules Lemoine. I don't know what you're talking about. But you do, Poirot said, his tone soft but unmistakably firm. You believed Agatha's letters were threats, that she was about to destroy your family name. Perhaps she was, but what she truly wanted was for you to take responsibility for the truth. Instead, you chose silence I didn't kill her. Poirot nodded. No, you didn't, but you knew who might, and you said nothing. Worse, I believe you offered her secrets to someone else, thinking they would scare her into retreat. Estelle didn't speak. Poirot rose and handed her the transcript. She hid this beneath her chair. She was never going to read it aloud. She was only going to give it to someone, and that someone was not you. She read in silence, her face drained of color. Did you record this conversation, mademoiselle? Or did you merely type it from memory? Estelle swallowed hard. I sent it to him, to the man at the gala. I thought, if he exposed her, if he made it impossible for her to go public, it would stop everything. And he refused, Poirot said. He chose not to act. Instead, he came to witness what you had set in motion. I didn't kill her, she repeated, but maybe I wanted her to fall. I just never thought that someone else would push her, Poirot finished. He turned away. You are guilty of cowardice, mademoiselle, but not murder. She left without a word. Poirot faced Hastings. The true killer knew of the documents. They knew Agatha wouldn't speak them aloud, but that she would give them to someone, perhaps to the stranger or someone else she trusted. That person panicked. Then it wasn't Estelle? Poirot shook his head. No, she was reckless, but her hand did not stir the poison. Poirot sat again. We are very near the end. All pieces are before us. The false identity, the observer, the missing man in staff uniform, the fear threaded through each suspect's actions. The key is motive, not for silence, but for control. And only one person has both the opportunity and the resources to pull that string quietly. Hastings leaned forward. Then who? Poirot did not answer directly. He reached instead for his pocket watch, checked the time, and smiled. It is nearly midnight, mon ami, and soon we shall gather everyone for the final act. The Bellefontaine lounge was quiet once more, but this time it had not been closed for an event. At Poirot's request, the hotel's management had discreetly secured the room for a private gathering. No music played, no wine was poured. Instead, the evening air sat heavy over the guests as they filed in one by one, each summoned by Poirot without explanation, each too nervous to refuse. Lord Calvé entered first, eyes scanning the room as if expecting a trap. Estelle followed, pale and silent, refusing to look at her uncle. Herr Grubner arrived flanked by two uniformed constables, no longer hiding the sweat on his collar. Madame Alizée Bertrand took her seat with a rigid poise, her gloved fingers folded so tightly her knuckles turned white. And then, finally, the last chair was filled, not by a suspect, but by Inspector Wren, who stood silently near the piano with arms crossed and a journal under his arm. Poirot stood in the center of the lounge, directly beneath the chandelier, the same spot where Lady Agatha had delivered her final toast. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, tonight I shall reveal not only the murderer of Lady Agatha Desmarais, but also the true purpose of a man known only as the stranger. He paused, letting the words settle. Let us begin with motive. Each of you had cause to fear Lady Agatha. She knew secrets, kept records, and prepared to expose them, though not to shame, but to correct. She hoped that by revealing the hidden wrongs among her peers, she could restore order to a corrupted circle. Poirot turned to Lord Calvé. You, monsieur, feared her exposure would dismantle your carefully protected financial house of cards. But you were too proud, too sure of your influence to act so directly. To Herr Grubner, you had more reason than most. Her letters implicated you in international fraud. But your panic came too late. You are not methodical, Herr Grubner. You are reactive. Grubner huffed but said nothing. Poirot continued, and then there is Mademoiselle Estelle, who, misguided though she was, believed she could redirect the danger by giving the stranger just enough to dissuade Agatha from speaking. Her guilt is moral, not criminal." Estelle flinched but made no sound. "But the true criminal," Poirot said, his voice firm now, "is the one who saw Agatha's trust as a threat. The one who understood that Agatha had hidden the evidence away not from her enemies, but from her friends. That person poisoned her in such a way that no one would notice, not the doctors, not the police. They used aconitine, delivered slowly, perhaps through her cosmetics or her afternoon tea. The glass was merely the trigger. Poirot turned to the table and lifted the final piece of evidence, the small velvet sachet of lavender found in Lady Agatha's handbag. This sachet was not merely scent. It was residue, infused with aconitine. It sat against her skin for hours. Wren straightened. "You're saying the poison was in this?" "Oui," Poirot said. "And it was placed there by someone who had access to her personal belongings, someone she trusted." His eyes moved to the last person he had not addressed. "Madame Alice Bertrand. You were her closest companion in recent years," Poirot said quietly. "She visited you often. She called on you the night before the gala. You prepared her tea. You handed her the sachet, claiming it would calm her nerves." Alice said nothing. Poirot continued. "You were once her aide, were you not? Before her husband's death, you helped her arrange events, manage correspondence, maintain her appearance. But when she began to write again, when she began to threaten the delicate order you had helped build, you realized her recklessness would undo both of you." Still no response. Poirot moved closer. "She planned to leave everything to a public archive. Not just letters, photographs, notes, documents implicating men and women you'd helped protect over the years. The network you had cultivated was about to collapse. And so, rather than confront her, you watched, you waited, and you used her trust to kill her without force, without mess, because you knew no one would look at you." Alice looked up. Her face was still, but her voice cracked as she spoke. She wanted to take it all down. Decades of discretion, gone. She said it was time the world knew, but she didn't care what it would do to me, or to those who didn't deserve it. And so you silenced her. She wouldn't stop. Alice's voice was barely a whisper now. "I begged her," I pleaded, "but she saw it as duty. She wasn't killing names. She was killing me." Poirot nodded. "You did not intend to murder her in public. You believed the dose would act hours later. But the stranger changed that everyone turned." Poirot stepped back, then addressed the room. "The stranger, Jules Lemoine, Alain Rousseau, or whichever name he last used, is not a killer. He is an observer, a man who trades in information, yes, but with rules. He knew someone would act. He knew how they would act. He came not to stop the crime, but to document it, to expose it after it had occurred. He lifted the final photograph, the one received in Paris. He left breadcrumbs. Not for justice, but for me. Because in his world, truth is not revealed. It is orchestrated, and he believes I was the only one capable of completing the score." Poirot looked around the room one final time. "Madame Bertrand, you are under arrest for the murder of Lady Agatha Desmarais. The method was clever, the motive desperate, but in the end, your silence, your calm, was the one thing that did not belong in a room full of people panicking." As Wren stepped forward, Alice rose slowly. She did not run, she did not speak. She only looked at Poirot and said, with the faintest of bitter smiles, "You weren't the only one she trusted." Then she allowed herself to be led away. As the room emptied, Hastings approached Poirot. "You did it." Again. "But something tells me you're still unsettled." Poirot nodded. "The murder is solved, yes. But the stranger, he is still watching." Somewhere, Hastings frowned. "Do you think we'll hear from him again?" Poirot smiled faintly. "No, Hastings. He'll hear from us. It was 3 days after Madame Alice Bertrand's arrest when the final envelope arrived. Delivered not by post, but slipped beneath the door of Poirot's flat at Whitehaven Mansions, it bore no stamp, no return address. Only the unmistakable handwriting that had now threaded itself through every stage of the case. Hastings, who found it while fetching the morning paper, handed it over with a raised brow. "No signature again," he said. "Do you think it's from the stranger?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. He unfolded the single sheet inside, reading it slowly. Hastings waited in silence, watching Poirot's eyes move, his brow crease slightly, and then relax, though not in relief. At last, Poirot handed the note over. "Monsieur Poirot, you saw the truth behind the performance." She hid her message in silence, but you listened between the pauses. "The justice system will do what it does. My task is done, but know this. The others are still out there. The ones who bought power with ruin, who live on secrets never meant to survive daylight. Lady Agatha nearly exposed them. I merely observed the consequence of that ambition. Until next time, should there be one." Hastings exhaled. He admits it all, doesn't he? That he knew. He didn't warn her. He didn't stop it. Poirot nodded. Mais oui. He watched as a chess player watches an opponent's final mistake, and he waited, not to act, but to see if anyone else would. "He sounds almost proud," Hastings said. "Not proud," Poirot replied. "Detached, as though morality does not bind him. His allegiance is to observation, not justice." Poirot stood and moved to his bookshelf, selecting a slim volume of Greek myth. "Do you recall the word manticore?" "Yes," Hastings said. "Lady Agatha mentioned it in her notes." "A code word, perhaps? Or a symbol? A creature with a human face, the body of a lion and a poisonous tail. A predator cloaked in civility. That is the role he plays. He moves through salons and drawing rooms not as an assassin, but as a reminder, to those with much to hide, that someone always sees." Poirot set the book down and paced slowly. "He gave me everything I needed. Eventually. Photographs. Hints. A trail of threads I could weave into a net. But he gave it on his terms. Not mine." Hastings frowned. "What if he returns? What if there's another observation he intends to make?" Poirot stopped. "Then I shall be ready. But not for him. For the one who thinks they are unseen." He retrieved a thin dossier from his desk drawer. His own copy of Lady Agatha's sealed letter to Le Matin de Paris. She had begun to see it too. Not just isolated corruption, but a pattern, a structure beneath the respectable world. And though Bertrand was the hand that delivered death, someone else gave her the reason to fear exposure. "You don't mean the stranger?" "No," Poirot said. "I believe someone else orchestrated the conditions. Bertrand merely acted, but someone, perhaps even multiple parties, benefited from the timing of Lady Agatha's death." Hastings gestured at the envelope. "But if this man is watching all of them, wouldn't he have seen that too?" "Possibly. Or," Poirot added, "he chose to limit his interference. He only steps forward when it suits his sense of balance." There was a knock at the door. Poirot opened it to find Wren standing there, cap in hand. "Thought you'd want to know," Wren said. Bertrand's barrister submitted a full confession. She claims full responsibility. Claims no one else knew of the poison. Says she acted alone. Poirot nodded slowly. And yet she left behind not a single trace of preparation. No receipts, no purchases, no compounding records. Wren shrugged. "You think someone else helped her?" Poirot turned back into the room. "Someone made it easy. Bertrand supplied the method. But the atmosphere, the fear, the manipulation, that came from elsewhere. And our silent observer saw it all. Perhaps he even nudged it. Closer, he walked to the window and looked out at the grey city. "I do not like games where rules are unclear," And this man, this A.R., plays by rules known only to himself. Hastings opened the envelope again and turned it over. Nothing else here. No fingerprint, no mark. It's as if he doesn't exist outside what he observes. Poirot's voice was quiet. Non. He exists. He has an agenda, but it is not one of justice, nor one of violence. It is one of memory. He does not kill. He ensures that no crime disappears. Wren was still standing awkwardly at the door. So, case closed? Poirot turned. Legally, yes. But morally, the question remains. What happens when the one who knows everything chooses to remain invisible? When knowledge becomes a form of power, and that power is never held to account? Wren shifted. Then maybe that's not your case, Poirot. Poirot smiled faintly. Perhaps not. But he has now made it personal. And I do not forget easily. Wren gave a nod and left, closing the door behind him. Hastings watched Poirot return to his desk and begin rearranging the photographs, lining them up in the order they had been received. Are you expecting another letter? Poirot shook his head. No, mon ami. I'm preparing for one. He placed the final image, Lady Agatha, pointing mid-toast, at the top of the sequence. Below it, he arranged the suspects, the locations, and then finally the last envelope with the signature A.R. It is not over, Poirot said quietly. He said, until next time. And men like that, men who trade in truth and silence, they always return. Hastings, watching Poirot's precise method, gave a slight shudder. You know, he said, in all our cases, I've never seen you disturbed by a killer the way you are by this man. Poirot looked up. Because, Hastings, the killer acts on impulse. Anger, fear, desperation. But this man, he tapped the envelope, he acts on observation. He watches the worst in people, not to stop it, but to record it. And as Poirot placed the photograph of the stranger beneath the rest, carefully aligned under the soft lamplight, one final truth echoed in the silence between them. The most dangerous man in the room is often the one who never speaks. A week had passed since the envelope bearing the signature A.R. was slid under Poirot's door. The case had been publicly closed, the newspapers printing a mixture of scandal and relief. Prominent philanthropist murdered by confidant, but Poirot knew better than to trust the public conclusion. It was neat, too neat. And so he continued, behind the scenes, assembling the scattered truths not included in court records. He had converted an entire wall in his study into a timeline, not just of Lady Agatha's death, but of the stranger's appearances. Hastings entered mid-morning with fresh tea and froze when he saw the extent of Poirot's handiwork. You've built an entire map, Hastings said, setting down the tray. Indeed, Poirot replied, standing with his back to the room. It is a map not of location, but of intentions. The stranger has left traces, even when he wished to remain unseen. Photos, marginal notes, newspaper headlines with subtle red circles. Poirot had linked them with thin twine, color-coded by date. In the center, the still unidentified face of A.R. stared out in black and white, calm, controlled, unknowable. I've traced his appearances to 4 prior events, Poirot explained. 2 political inquiries, 1 banking collapse in Geneva, and a corporate whistleblower case in Istanbul. In each, no crime was officially attributed to him, but in each, someone received anonymous documentation just before the scandal broke open. And you think he's the same man? Poirot nodded. The descriptions vary. Different names, different accents. But the behavior, identical. He appears at the periphery of injustice, not as participant. As witness Hastings crossed his arms. So he's made it his mission to stalk corruption. Non, mon ami, he catalogues it. That is far more precise. Poirot stepped away from the wall. He collects moments of moral collapse. He does not stop them. He preserves them like insects in glass. Why? That I do not yet know. A sharp rap came at the door. Poirot answered it to find an unexpected visitor, Cécile Durand, the Paris journalist who had been the intended recipient of Lady Agatha's sealed letter. Her eyes were sharp behind narrow spectacles, and she held a leather satchel close to her chest. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with barely disguised irritation, "it seems I have been dragged into a ghost story." Poirot welcomed her inside. "Mademoiselle Durand, I believe Lady Agatha trusted you more than most. Did she ever send you a second letter?" Durand sat stiffly. "No, but a week ago I received a package. It contained a USB drive and a single page. The note simply read, 'He failed her. You must not.'" Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "And the contents?" 47 files, financial records, names, a directory of shell companies tied to charity networks across Europe. It reads like the back end of a criminal ledger. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And no signature?" "No. But the metadata shows the files originated on a private machine located here in London, and embedded in the code of the spreadsheet header is a tag, AR_Vault_Desmarais. Hastings exhaled. "So he had everything all along?" Durand nodded. "Which begs the question, why didn't he publish it himself?" Poirot stood, beginning to pace. Because to publish it himself would be to choose a side. And our stranger? He prefers the balance to remain tense, not tipped. He handed it to you, mademoiselle, because Lady Agatha trusted your ethics, and because you're not part of the machinery. He observes, "Do you think he'll contact me again?" Poirot smiled faintly. "If he does, it will not be for conversation." Durand stood. "Then I'll do what she wanted. I'll publish, and when they ask where it came from, tell them," Poirot interrupted, "that Lady Agatha spoke from beyond the grave. That is all they need." Durand gave a short nod, then left as briskly as she came. Hastings sat back down. "So now it's going public?" Poirot nodded. "The vault is open. The secrets she died to expose will breathe at last. But Hastings, that is not what disturbs me." He returned to the wall and pointed to the center. "Look here." Each of the stranger's appearances occurs not at the height of corruption, but at its unraveling. He waits until things begin to collapse. Then he arrives, not to stop it, but to ensure it finishes. "You think he orchestrates the collapse?" "No, I think he ensures it is not buried." Hastings folded his arms. "But he's still hiding something, isn't he?" Poirot turned slowly. "Oui. A man so precise, so careful, does not send notes without purpose. The phrase, 'until next time,' that is a warning, not a farewell." Just then, the phone rang. Poirot answered. A familiar voice greeted him. "Inspector Wren." "There's something you should see," Wren said. "A man was found dead this morning. No ID, no wallet, but in his jacket was a photo of you, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's grip on the receiver tightened. "Describe him." "Tall, clean-shaven, mid-40s, gray eyes, wearing a white linen shirt beneath a black coat. No obvious wounds. No sign of a struggle. But the location was odd." "Yes?" "A booth in a small underground jazz club. Back corner. Sitting as if waiting for someone." Poirot was silent. "He matches the description of your stranger, doesn't he?" Poirot closed his eyes. "Where is the body?" "Morgue. No fingerprints on file, no name. But his watch. Expensive. Swiss. And engraved on the back. To A.R. In silence, we see." Poirot hung up the phone slowly. Hastings was staring. "Do you think he's dead?" "I do not know," Poirot murmured, "but I must see him." They went immediately to the city morgue. The pathologist led them to a private examination room. The sheet was pulled back. Poirot studied the face, calm, unmarked, as if asleep. "It's him," Hastings said. "Has to be." But Poirot did not speak. He bent slightly, inspecting the fingers. Clean, manicured. Then the jacket. A slip of paper had been missed, tucked in the inner seam. Poirot retrieved it. Just one sentence, scrawled in that same familiar hand. "This is not the end. You must look higher." Poirot stood up, expression unreadable. No wallet, no prints, a warning, and yet a death. Hastings stepped back. "You think it's staged?" Poirot replied quietly, "It is a message." "From whom?" Poirot turned toward the door. "From a man who no longer wishes to watch, but to disappear." The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. It tapped softly on the windows of Whitehaven mansions, a rhythmic backdrop to Poirot's long, uninterrupted silence. He sat by the window, unmoving, a half-drunk tisane forgotten on the table beside him. Hastings had grown uneasy, not by Poirot's stillness, which he had witnessed many times before, but by its weight. It was not the stillness of deduction, it was the stillness of suspicion. "So," Hastings said at last, "what do you think? Was it really him, that man in the morgue?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the street below, where umbrellas moved like silent ghosts through the grey. Finally, he said, "That man was meant to be him." But it was not. Hastings blinked. "Not?" But he matched the description. "Ah, oui. Too well. A stranger who has eluded every surveillance lens, every police record, every ledger of identity. And then, suddenly, we find him seated in a jazz club, carrying a photograph of me, wearing an engraved watch, and leaving behind a handwritten note." Poirot shook his head slowly. "It is too precise, too poetic. But surely no one would fake their own death in such a way." Poirot turned. "No, Hastings. Only a man who wants to vanish without leaving a shadow. And what better way to erase oneself than to die in public while remaining alive in truth?" Hastings paled. "You think he's out there now, watching us again?" "I think," Poirot said, "he wants us to stop watching him." He stood suddenly and crossed to his desk. The folder from the morgue, delivered to him by Wren, was still sealed with red wax. Poirot broke it and opened the final forensic report. He read in silence, nodding once as he found what he suspected. "The dental records," Poirot said, "do not match any known database. The coroner's assumption is that they belong to a man from Eastern Europe. But see this." He pointed to the forensic notes. The jaw showed signs of surgical restructuring. Subtle. Cosmetic Hastings frowned. "So he altered his appearance?" Poirot smiled. "No, mon ami. Someone made this man resemble the stranger. Not fully, but enough. With the right coat, the right haircut, and no prints. Close enough to pass?" Hastings sat down heavily. "Then who was he?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A decoy. A man sacrificed to create silence." There was a knock. Wren entered, umbrella dripping, and handed Poirot a small envelope. "Another one?" Left at Scotland Yard this time, Poirot opened it with careful fingers. A single typed card read, "It was never about Lady Agatha. She was merely the loudest. You are looking down. You must look higher. We do not fear exposure. We fear interruption." A.R. Wren exhaled. "He's taunting you." Poirot shook his head. "He is redirecting me. Telling me this case is not about the past. It is about something still in motion. The killing of Lady Agatha, the letters, the secrets. They were all part of a much larger structure." "And what's that?" Hastings asked. "What could be higher than the woman who held half of London's secrets?" Poirot tapped the card. "The architecture of silence, mon ami. Networks of influence, of immunity, of curated ignorance. I believe Lady Agatha tried to light a single match, but the room was soaked in oil." And A.R. saw that Poirot retrieved Lady Agatha's journal from his desk drawer and flipped to the page marked with the word Manticore. There, scribbled beneath the triangle symbol, was a final phrase that had escaped Poirot's attention before. The root does not live in London. It flowers here, but is watered in Zurich. He turned to Wren. We need travel clearance. Zurich, and we must inquire about the Vaudreuil Institute. Wren furrowed his brow. That's not a name I've heard. No, Poirot said, because it does not want to be heard. He tapped the card again. We are no longer looking for a man. We are now looking for a structure. They arrived in Zurich 2 days later. The air was colder, the sky a pale eggshell white, and the quiet efficiency of the city seemed to amplify the tension Poirot carried in his posture. He had booked no hotel. Instead, he directed Hastings and Wren straight to a nondescript building on the edge of the Uetliberg district. White stone, no signage, no front desk. A woman in a pale green suit met them at the door. This is private property. Poirot smiled politely. Ah, mademoiselle. We are here on behalf of an inquiry tied to international corruption. I believe your director will wish to speak with us. Your name? Hercule Poirot. The name did something. She stepped back slightly, nodded, and disappeared inside. 5 minutes later, they were led into a narrow conference room. There, a man of indeterminate age, hair slicked back, hands clasped over a manila folder, greeted them. I am Director Koenig. You mentioned the name Vaudreuil. Yes, Poirot said. We are tracing the origins of a network Lady Agatha Desmarais attempted to expose. Her files mentioned a root source based here. I believe it is your organization. Koenig's face didn't flicker. We are a think tank. We advise diplomatic channels on neutral intelligence. We are not involved in banking or corporate fraud. Poirot opened his case and slid across the photograph of the man believed to be A.R. Koenig's hand paused. It was only for a second, but Poirot saw it. This man, Koenig said slowly. We do not know him. But he knows you, Poirot said. He knew Lady Agatha's name. He knew the phrase Vaudreuil Institute, and he knew you would deny him. Koenig stood. Monsieur Poirot, I think your inquiry has reached its limit. Poirot nodded, stood as well, and smiled faintly. Then allow me one final question. The phrase, in silence, we see. Does it mean anything to you? Koenig's eyes twitched, just once. Then he said flatly, no. They were escorted out minutes later. In the taxi, Hastings leaned forward. He's lying. Poirot said nothing. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a recording pen, its light blinking faintly. What did you get? Poirot tapped his coat pocket. Enough. In Koenig's voice print, there were 3 stress spikes. On the name Vaudreuil, on the image of A.R., and on the phrase, in silence, we see. That confirms what we feared. Hastings looked out at the snow-swept streets. Which is? That A.R. was never acting alone. He was not rogue. He was sanctioned. You mean? Poirot nodded. The stranger who knew everything knew because he was permitted to know. He glanced at the card again. We do not fear exposure. We fear interruption. Poirot whispered, he was part of them. But he lost faith Zurich was behind them, but Poirot's mind remained there, fixed not on the man they had gone to find, but on the system that had created him. In the days following their return to London, Poirot withdrew into silence. He read through the coded records Lady Agatha had left behind, matched them against Durand's files, and continued to track each connection A.R. had hinted at. Not to solve a murder now, but to confront a structure more vast and deliberate than any single crime. Hastings, who had grown used to Poirot's silent concentration, still sensed something deeper this time. A shift, a quiet burden Poirot had chosen not to voice. One night, Hastings asked, "You don't intend to pursue them publicly, do you?" Poirot didn't look up from his notes. "No, that is not how this must end." Hastings folded his arms. "But we know. We have the names. We have the evidence. Why not turn it over to the authorities?" Because the authorities already know, Poirot said quietly. Not all, perhaps, but enough, and they have chosen not to act. Then what are we doing? Poirot finally turned, and for a moment Hastings saw something in his friend he rarely did. Fatigue, not physical, but moral. I am ensuring it is preserved, Hastings, he said. Not to dismantle them, but to deny them the comfort of secrecy. That is the only power left to men like us. A letter arrived the next morning. No envelope, just a single page, resting on the sill beneath Poirot's study window, weighted by a pebble. The same neat handwriting. You have done what I could not. You made it visible. But visibility is not the same as collapse. You understand this now. The structure does not fear being seen. It fears being misunderstood. I am gone, truly now, but others remain. Some watch, some wait, some forget. I chose to watch. You chose to remember. That is the difference. A.R. Hastings read it twice. So, he's finished? Poirot nodded slowly. He has withdrawn. Not to hide, but to erase his name entirely. He was never trying to be known. He only wanted the story told without him. He folded the letter and tucked it beside Lady Agatha's original sealed file. And now, it has been. In the weeks that followed, Le Matin de Paris published the story in serialized form. The Desmarais papers, they called it, an exposé spanning decades, implicating names long thought untouchable. The impact was slow at first, but certain. A quiet inquiry here, a resignation there, assets frozen, foundations audited. No arrests, no confessions. But discomfort began to ripple through the circles Lady Agatha had once moved in. Some denied everything, others vanished from public life. And through it all, Poirot said nothing. No interviews, no letters, no claims to fame. He let the truth do what it could. One evening, Hastings found Poirot standing before the fireplace, an envelope in hand. One final envelope he had kept sealed until now. "You're going to open it?" Hastings asked. Poirot nodded. It was left with Lady Agatha's solicitor. To be delivered to me after the story went public. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, written in Agatha's unmistakable hand. My dear Poirot, I knew you would come. Not because of duty, but because of order. You cannot stand chaos, and that is why I trust you. This story is bigger than me, bigger than Calvert or Grubner or even Estelle. There is a quiet machine beneath everything. It runs not on oil or gears, but on fear. It does not threaten. It whispers. I have written what I could, but someone must connect it. Someone who is not frightened by shadows that move like friends. If you are reading this, then you have done what I could not. Thank you. Agatha. Poirot read the last line twice. Then he folded it neatly and slid it into the drawer with the rest of the archive. She knew, he said softly. Knew what? Hastings asked. That she wouldn't survive long enough to speak her truth aloud. That someone, if not Bertrand, then another, would stop her. But she also knew she didn't need to survive if someone else was willing to finish the sentence for her. Poirot stepped back from the desk and looked at the neatly arranged archive. We have not exposed a killer. We have exposed a tendency, a condition that festers beneath privilege and power, the belief that some truths are too dangerous to confront. He paused. But the truth does not disappear just because it is inconvenient. They walked out onto the balcony, the London evening thick with fog. Lights glimmered below like tiny lies trying to look like stars. Poirot said, "The stranger has vanished. A.R. is gone, but his shadow will remain. So long as there are men and women who benefit from silence, there will be someone willing to watch, just out of sight." Hastings turned. And you? Poirot smiled. I do not watch. I intervene. And as the fog rose around them and the city swallowed its secrets once again, Poirot stood unmoved, order in his spine, clarity in his gaze, and justice, no matter how quiet, still burning behind the glass of his little grey cells. Spring crept in quietly that year, as if London itself were reluctant to turn the page. The city streets softened beneath blooming branches and the earliest rays of returning sun, but inside Whitehaven mansions, Hercule Poirot remained as precise as ever, though something in his routine had shifted. There were no new cases, no fresh interviews, no public acknowledgements. Instead, his time was consumed with sorting, annotating, and locking away what he now referred to as the archive of things half said. The Desmarais papers had done their work. Agatha's files had become the centerpiece of a slow-burning inquiry, still developing in backrooms and newsrooms across Europe. The initial flurry of reaction had ebbed into something harder to track. Quiet interviews, informal retirements, unexplained financial freezes. A scandal had bloomed, but not exploded. It grew, instead, like a mold beneath paint. Poirot catalogued every echo. He sat now with Hastings in the parlour, his notes arrayed like a chessboard on the low table between them. The fire was low. Outside, the muffled sounds of life returning to London carried through the open window. Hastings studied him. "You're not finished, are you?" Poirot didn't look up. "The case is closed. But its consequences, they linger. Like perfume on a traitor's collar, he picked up a clipping from Le Matin de Paris, a follow-up piece by Cécile Durand, tracking a series of resignations within an international advisory board known as the Greybridge Committee. The article mentioned no crimes, no accusations, just movement and silence. "You believe they were part of it?" Poirot nodded. Not all knowingly, but connected. The stranger was not one man. He was the symptom. R merely gave it shape. He tapped the page. And now the shape has dissolved. Hastings leaned back. "But you think he's still alive?" "I know he is. Because death leaves mess. And he left none. That corpse was not a body. It was a message. A controlled disappearance. The final move of a man who no longer wished to carry other people's truths." Poirot stood and walked to the desk. From the top drawer, he retrieved a sealed envelope. It had no writing, no markings. He had found it weeks ago, tucked behind the back panel of his own filing cabinet, a place no one else could have reached without knowing its existence. He slit it open now, revealing a single card. "Truth outlives the one who tells it. I chose not to speak. You chose not to forget. We have both served our part. A.R." Hastings read it and gave a low whistle. "He knew you'd find it." Poirot nodded. "He knew I would be thorough. He understood me, that is. What made him dangerous?" He returned the card to the envelope and sealed it again. "You're keeping it?" Hastings asked. "I am not returning it. But I'm also not displaying it. It is part of a record now." A reminder, Poirot sat down again, hands folded. For a long while, neither man spoke. Then Hastings, quietly, "Would you have done it differently?" "Done what?" "Handled him. The stranger. If you had known at the beginning what you know now, that he wasn't evil, just hidden." Poirot tilted his head. "If I had known, I may not have stopped him. But I would still have chased him." Hastings looked puzzled. Poirot explained, "Because the danger of men like A.R. is not what they do. It is what they enable." His silence allowed power to fester. His observation protected no one. He left Agatha to die, not because he wished it, but because he believed it was not his role to intervene. He sighed. "That, mon ami, is cowardice cloaked in neutrality." The phone rang, sharp and sudden. Poirot answered. It was Cécile Durand. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice clipped. "You were right. There's more. The documents he gave me. They're not complete. Explain, mademoiselle. Some of the banking records reference codes that don't match any of the charity fronts we've identified. But I cross-referenced them with shipping manifests through a Swiss port authority. The codes do exist, but under logistics tags, not financial ones. Poirot's mind turned instantly. He gave you enough to start a fire, but not enough to direct the smoke. Exactly, Durand said. And I think the rest, whatever it is still out there. Merci, Poirot said. Send me everything. He hung up and turned to Hastings. It continues. What does? The stranger did not destroy the vault. He simply opened the door and left. There is more. Deeper. Something Agatha may never have reached. And he left it untouched. For us, or for whoever dares next. Hastings hesitated. But why? Poirot smiled faintly. Because even the watcher wants to be watched. Eventually. He stood again, and this time he opened the cabinet beneath the wall bookshelf, the place he kept what he once called unfinished threads. He pulled out a fresh file, labeled only with a single word. Continuum. What's that? Hastings asked. Poirot didn't answer at first. He laid the file on the desk and opened it. Inside were a map of Zurich, 3 newspaper clippings, and a small scrap of tracing paper containing a red ink diagram, 3 interlocking circles, each marked with a different phrase. Observation, compromise, denial. At their center, an X. I found this in the stranger's Paris flat, Poirot said quietly, tucked behind a drawer. I didn't understand it at the time. And now? I believe it is a design, Poirot said. Not of people, but of principles. The principles that allow corruption to survive undisturbed. Each one keeps the other in balance. Break any one, and the rest collapse. He tapped the X. This is where Agatha stood. And why she died, Hastings whispered. And you? Poirot looked up. I intend to redraw the circles. A long silence followed. Then Poirot closed the file, returned it to the cabinet, and locked it. For now, we rest. And then? Poirot smiled gently. Then, mon ami, we resume. He walked toward the window and looked out once more at the quiet hum of London life. Beneath it, he now saw threads where once he saw routine, silences where once there were conversations. In every unspoken glance, in every half-told truth, Poirot now heard echoes of the stranger, still watching somewhere. Not as villain, not as ally, but as proof that even knowledge can become a mask, and that the real battle is not against lies. It is against the comfort of not asking questions. Poirot straightened his cuffs, adjusted his tie, and whispered one final sentence to the fogged glass before him. The morning fog curled along the Thames like smoke from a long-forgotten fire. Inside Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat alone in his study, a steaming tisane by his side and every document from the Desmarais affair filed neatly in a locked cabinet. The case had been resolved, at least in the public eye. Lady Agatha's murder had found its culprit in Madame Alice Bertrand. The stranger had vanished. The press had moved on. But Poirot had not, because something still remained, a sliver out of place, a thread left dangling, not from the crime, but from the stranger's final message, you must look higher. That phrase, simple and direct, had sat in Poirot's mind like a splinter, and now, at last, he had found what it pointed to. Hastings entered quietly. You asked me to come early. Oui, Hastings. Because today... We closed the loop. Poirot stood and crossed to his desk. He retrieved a final photograph, one he had previously withheld from everyone, even Wren. It was taken by a club photographer at the Bellefontaine Gala, just minutes before Lady Agatha collapsed. In it, the crowd raised their glasses, smiling, unaware. But in the far background, nearly out of frame, was a man partially obscured by a pillar. Not the stranger, but Lord Edward Calvé. Hastings frowned. But we saw him. He made no move. He gave no toast. He wasn't near her. Non, Poirot said, but he was watching the stranger. Not with curiosity, but with fear. He pulled out the enlarged version of the photo, overlaid with angle tracing. And do you see what Lady Agatha was doing just before she shifted her seat? She looked over her shoulder. And Calvet looked away. You think she noticed something? Poirot nodded. I believe she realized something. That the man she thought was the enemy, the stranger, was not her killer. The danger was not the unknown. It was the man she had known all her life. He handed Hastings a copy of the original transcript Agatha had hidden. Notice this line again. She believes it will restore her legacy, but she'll only be opening a tomb for all of us. That wasn't Estelle, Hastings whispered. That was him. Exactly. It was Calvet who signed off on the accounts, Calvet who lobbied to prevent the documents from becoming public, and when Bertrand poisoned Agatha, it was not her idea alone. It was suggested quietly, cleverly, not with orders. With implications, Poirot opened a drawer and produced a copy of Bertrand's initial confession. She claimed she acted alone. But see this line. She said it would destroy everything we'd worked for. I asked what she meant, and she just smiled. Who is she? Bertrand only mentioned Lady Agatha by name. But here she is talking about someone else entirely. Someone who told her the cost of exposure Hastings swallowed. Calvet. Poirot folded his hands. He didn't poison her. He didn't deliver the sachet. But he allowed it, encouraged it, and when the stranger arrived, not to blackmail but to observe, Calvet panicked. He tried to follow him, but the man vanished. So instead, Calvet redirected suspicion toward Estelle. Then Bertrand, are we going to arrest him? Poirot shook his head. No, mon ami, we're going to unmask him. The following evening, Poirot requested a quiet dinner at Lord Calvet's London residence. To his surprise, Calvet accepted, even offering a private room and bottle of his best champagne. To resolution, he said. Poirot waited until the first course had been cleared. You've hidden your fear well, Lord Calvet. Calvet's hand paused mid-pour. Fear. Come now, Poirot. Haven't we all had quite enough drama over these last few weeks? Poirot leaned forward. You were at the gala early. Earlier than you claimed. You watched the stranger from across the room, and when Agatha looked at you that night, you looked away. Not because you were hiding guilt, but because you saw recognition in her eyes. Calvet set the bottle down. That's absurd. You knew what she was about to reveal. You tried to stop it, but not with threats, with pressure, with whispered caution. But she didn't listen. So when Bertrand confided in you her fears, you let them bloom. You never gave the order, but you gave her permission. Calvet's expression didn't change. Do you have proof? Poirot tapped the inside of his lapel. Your voice. On the transcript. From a conversation recorded months ago. Your cadence, your phrasing, your tell. The way you overuse the phrase you must understand. I have matched it to 4 speeches you gave publicly. Calvet's jaw stiffened. What do you want? I want nothing, Poirot said. Lady Agatha is dead. The stranger is gone. You will not be arrested. You will not be tried. But you will never be unknown again. He stood. Tomorrow morning, a final installment of the Desmarais papers will be published. It will not name you, but it will describe you, in detail, and you will spend the rest of your life answering questions you cannot comfortably deny. Calvet sat back, defeated but composed. You're not the judge, Poirot. Non, Poirot said, but I am the mirror. And you have always feared being seen. He left without finishing his tea. The next day, the paper ran a final anonymous testimony, detailing a silent instigator who had orchestrated reputational protections across 3 countries for over a decade. No name was printed, but those who needed to understand, understood. Calvet withdrew from public life weeks later, citing health. Bertrand, already in custody, refused all further interviews. Estelle quietly founded a scholarship in her aunt's name, and the stranger. No more letters. No more signs. But Poirot knew. Somewhere out there, he was still watching, and perhaps, even now, he was watching Poirot in return. Late one evening, Hastings found Poirot once again arranging files. "You're still working?" Poirot nodded. "The case is finished. But justice, mon ami, is not a verdict. It is a rhythm. It continues." He held up a final card, newly added to the drawer. "Hercule Poirot," the man who refused to blink. Hastings smiled. "Did you write that?" Poirot shook his head. "No, it was left in my hat." They both laughed, and Poirot, master of detail, solver of secrets, destroyer of illusions, allowed himself, just for a moment, to be at peace.